I guess it's kind of a bit of an obvious question, but obvious answer to a certain extent. But it'd be good to just hear you kind of break it down. If you take it to why is it not under control? Why do organisations not have this sorted? Because you kind of, if you take a real basic view of it, you say, well, it's clear and obvious you should have control over this. It's clear and obvious you should be able to answer the question of, that a CEO might ask, which might be, what's the most effective use of our resources? Why haven't they got it under control?
I think a CEO might even ask a simpler question. How many contractors do I have in my network? And I don't think companies can answer that one.
Who's on the pitch?
Yeah, right. Why? I don't think it's how business has been created. Organizational silos. Everybody. So when you think about extended workforce and the amount of people, let's think about and the amount of people involved. Why are there so many people involved? Is because in the end, in order to get control, you need to manage something other than a linear life cycle. Like if you think about a procurement organization, procurement is responsible for providing the framework for source to pay. Okay. We were just talking about systems access. Systems access doesn't fit in source to pay, but a contractor is going to show up at some capacity in the life cycle of this contractor. A company has some level amount of strategy. There's some level of sourcing activity where this contractor is acquired or assigned. They have to be onboarded. Well, if you're thinking about a linear source to pay process, procurement's not involved in that anymore. It gets handed off to IT for onboarding, background check, whatever. And then that worker does his onboarding and he goes and does services delivery, i.e. he does the work that he was required to do, submits his timesheet, gets invoice, or submits his SOW. Well, that's not always a procurement responsibility either. That's somebody else. So you got these bits and pieces of process responsibility because people operate and think about end-to-end linear process when we need to think more about the management of a life cycle.
And this is also this. Sorry to interrupt you. This is also where it ties into the point you're making around self-service.
Yeah,
and that kind of it's a more holistic approach, because otherwise you get this diffusion of responsibility, and certain people are responsible for certain parts of the overarching life cycle. But ultimately, on one end, you've got a buyer, service work buyer. On the other end, you've got somebody or an organization delivering work.
Yeah. And when you think about life cycle, which should break across these verticals, these siloed verticals of linear processes, you need a cross-functional steerco. And I don't think cross-functional steercos exist to the level that is required to get this level of oversight, governance, or control in place, because it's not how business, I mean, quite frankly, it's just not traditionally how business models have been set up. And a procurement organization shouldn't be responsible for the onboarding of an individual, right? That's somebody else's job. It's somebody else's specialty. But those teams, those leaders need to have the platform or the opportunity to connect and speak and make sure that strategies and operations and transactions or executions are working in sync. Dare I say, there's orchestration so that they make the right decisions and their strategies are aligned, right? So I think going back to your question of like, why isn't it in place today? You can probably pick your root cause, but I would say it's because sometimes business teams are still trying to figure out themselves how to work end to end. And now it's no
Yeah.
longer end to end. It's continuous life cycle management that's required.
Yeah. And I think in certain areas, particularly kind of outcome-based complex services, professional services, there's also been an element of it's just too complicated. Whether it's, saying, well, the technology doesn't support it, or it's also the fact that this type of work delivery has grown very rapidly, and we're in a much more services-led economy,
Hmm.
and there's much more outsourcing of work. Go back 60, 70 years, job for life. You're a company person, and you get the gold watch at the end of your however many years service. Totally different world now. Gig workers, much more outsourced service delivery, a blend of different workforce delivery channels. So the complexity around it, particularly on the services side, I would say you're right, it's not 100% a solved problem with regards to the kind of staff augmentation, in the sense that when you get to the kind of more factory shift-based work type scenarios, that can have quite a lot of complexity, be very fast moving. But the ultimately dealing with people and time in some ways is simpler than dealing with intangibles that you
Yeah.
might get within a professional services engagement, where it's like, well, how do we define this, this piece of consulting work? And well, it's very easy for people to say, well, let's not bother. Let's just work it out as we go along. And what do the outcomes need to look like? Well,
Yeah.
no one really knows. So I think there's
Hmm.
definitely always been a little bit of an excuse available for people to
Yeah.
say that's just too difficult. And obviously,
Hmm.
the world we're operating in now, that's not acceptable because it's such a large amount of money that is spent on this stuff, and there's such a high reliance that organizations have to these external service providers. But also, you've got AI now, so large amounts of unstructured data. Great, bring it on. And
Yeah.
complexity is the excuse that it's not a solvable problem doesn't exist so much. But I think you're right in what you talk about in terms of the way that businesses have been set up and the way that they've been structured. But also, businesses, there's so much more flexibility required from businesses now that, we're all having to adapt to technology changes and just the way things are working and changes in the market. But there's a massive pressure on organizations to keep up with that. And as I said at the beginning, staying competitive, it's about being able to adapt to that. And so, again, this is an adaptation that organizations, we're talking about this. We know there are great opportunities for a lot of companies. I definitely feel like the ones that don't do it are going to be putting themselves at risk in the sense of being able to compete in the market.
Yeah. Lots of points there. So working backwards, you talk about companies that need to adapt in the market and be quick. In the end, I think we're talking a lot about how do we enable back office to keep up with front office,
Right.
right? Um, and back office can enable front office to win in the market, again, by creating infrastructure that enables self-service and continuing to focus on providing service quality, which is self-service, user experience, and bringing insights. The business moves so fast, the business doesn't want to know the definitions of your contingent labor program. They don't want to know tenure controls or whatever, but they do need to understand their options, the implications of those options, so that they can make the best made decision for their business at that time. How do we hire? I need a quality engineer in this factory. What are my options? What's the trend? What's the recommendation and why? Okay, let's move, right? I don't think that'll ever go away. I think about working backwards to what you were saying, Johnny, around the complexity, right? I appreciate you starting to shift from time and expense to now let's talk about like outcomes and the complexity of services. It's just too hard has been a good reason for the professional services organization to write the SOW. Like I think fundamentally there's got to be an opportunity or a recognition that says, if you know what you want, write it down and tell the services organization what it is you want and set the expectation for your deliverables or for your outcomes. Don't let the consultant write it for you because they'll know the contract better than you will. And I think you could probably provide the best technology. You can enable the best controls, but in the end, you have to take ownership of what it is you're writing and what it is you want. And as we think about greater dependency upon services, you're buying deliverables, you're buying outcomes, you're spending a lot of time building SLAs and KPIs and metrics. You're not managing it, monitoring it, or measuring it. Are you getting the value that was promised? And I think about projects where the project was all focused on, as an outsider, reading the contract, looking at the SLA agreement, getting the data. Was the data, was the performance of the BPO provider or the MSP matching what was agreed upon in the contract? And if it wasn't, what's the rebate? What's the discount? What's the penalty fee, et cetera, that wasn't taken advantage of? Or what's the bonus to be given to the provider because they were achieving those numbers? I think you have one project where it is a 100-page contract. I read it all. Yeah. And in the document, it was specifically talking about reporting scorecard, KPIs, and SLAs. I then asked the client, I said, can you please give me a copy of the scorecard? And I was looking at two completely different scorecards. I don't know, and so the feedback or the recommendation is spend time in your contract building what it is you want that's going to get you to that value, and make sure you have the mechanism in place that allows you to hold that provider and that team accountable to the outcome you're going to achieve. That's how you get control over a growing dependency upon services. And I think how you take complexity and make it simple.
Yeah, yeah, I 100% agree, and it's something where there's a lot more meaningful conversation in the market. Um, but I do feel like it's still fairly immature in terms of a problem that has been solved by a lot of organizations. But that means there's a lot of opportunity to solve it.